You'd think nothing could go wrong on a peaceful Sunday morning, right? You're sitting in your living room, enjoying your coffee, and your cat, Whiskers, is lounging under the shade of your favorite tree, one you've nurtured for years. It's the kind of tranquility that makes you feel like life's in perfect balance. Then, without warning, you hear a sharp crack of a pellet gunshot. You freeze. Your heart sinks. You look outside, and there she is, Karen, the self-appointed HOA enforcer, standing at the edge of your yard, pellet gun in hand, grinning like she's just done something heroic. She's aiming at the tree. Not just any tree, either. Your federally protected elderberry tree. The tree that's been home to birds, squirrels, and your cat, who loves to lounge beneath its branches. And in that instant, Karen didn't just break a rule. She made the biggest mistake of her life. She didn't know it, but the woman beside you isn't just a housewife. She's a wildlife federal officer, and she spent years protecting animals and habitats from people exactly like Karen. Let me tell you how this explosive confrontation went down, because when Karen crossed the line, she didn't just pick a fight with us. She picked a fight with someone far beyond her reach. It was just another lazy Sunday morning. The sunlight was filtering in through the blinds, and everything felt quiet, peaceful. I sat in the living room, coffee cup in hand, watching Sarah move around in the kitchen, preparing her usual Sunday breakfast. You'd think life couldn't get any better, right? Whiskers, our cat, was in her favorite spot under the elderberry tree in our front yard. We'd planted that tree 2 years ago. It wasn't just for shade or looks. It was a federally protected species, something most people didn't realize. But we did, and so did Whiskers. It was her little sanctuary, and to us, it was the heart of the yard. But then, the sound of a sharp crack shattered the silence. I turned toward the window just as I saw Karen, our neighbor, standing on the edge of her driveway. She was holding something, and before I could register it fully, she took aim at our tree and fired. I was stunned. "Karen, what the hell are you doing?" I shouted, rushing toward the door. I couldn't believe what I had just witnessed. She had shot a pellet gun at our protected tree, barely missing Whiskers, who had been peacefully lying beneath it moments earlier. Karen turned toward me with a smug expression on her face, as if what she'd just done was completely justified. "That tree is an eyesore," she said dismissively. "It's ruining the look of the neighborhood. All the birds that hang around it are a nuisance. I'm just taking care of it." I could feel my blood boiling. What right did she have to destroy something that wasn't even hers to touch? But as I stood there, ready to lose my temper, I remembered something important. Sarah, my wife, wasn't just any homeowner. She wasn't someone who would stand idly by while someone damaged what we had worked so hard for. Sarah walked out calmly, her expression steely but composed. She stood next to me, eyeing Karen, who was still clutching the pellet gun, like she had done something righteous. "Karen," Sarah said, her voice cool but carrying a weight that made it clear this wasn't going to end well for Karen. "You've just made a huge mistake." Karen sneered, clearly not understanding the gravity of her actions. "What's your problem? It's just a tree." "It's not just any tree, Karen," Sarah replied, stepping forward. "That's a federally protected elderberry tree. You just shot at it. And I'm a wildlife federal officer, so I can tell you right now, you've just broken the law." Karen's cocky grin faded, replaced with confusion. She glanced at me, then back at Sarah, unsure how to react. "Wait, you're a what?" Sarah didn't flinch. "I'm a wildlife federal officer. That means I enforce federal regulations when it comes to wildlife protection, including trees like this one. And when you fire a weapon at a protected species, that's a federal offense." I watched as Karen's face turned pale. It wasn't just fear, it was realization. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Sarah didn't wait for Karen to stammer out an excuse. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a citation. "You're getting a citation for this, Karen. You can either pay the fine and move on, or we can escalate this, and I'll let the feds handle it. Trust me, you don't want to go that route." For a long moment, Karen didn't say anything. Her mouth opened, then closed, as she tried to process the situation. But Sarah wasn't done yet. "You've made your decision now," Sarah said. "You're going to answer for this." Karen's eyes shifted between Sarah and the citation in her hand. Finally, she muttered, I didn't know it was that serious. I just thought it was a stupid tree." "It's not just a tree, Karen," Sarah said firmly, her voice unwavering. "It's part of a protected ecosystem, and now you're going to be held accountable for your actions." As Karen stood there, completely stunned by the turn of events, Sarah didn't back down. She handed Karen the citation and took a step back, waiting for her to process it. Karen's hands were shaking, and she looked like she might either break down or explode. But before she could say anything else, Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced at it quickly, then looked back at Karen. "I just got word from the HOA," Sarah said, her tone shifting. "They've been investigating you, Karen. It seems like you've been cutting down other protected trees around the neighborhood without permission. And guess what? They're not happy about it." Karen's eyes went wide, and her smug attitude evaporated completely. What are you talking about?" "The HOA got wind of your little tree removal project, and with the evidence I just handed them, they've decided to take action. It looks like you'll be getting more than just a citation from me. The HOA will be filing charges against you for your actions," Sarah said, with a cold smile. Karen's face twisted in disbelief. The tables had turned completely, and she was no longer the neighborhood enforcer. She was now the one in trouble, and there was nothing she could do about it. The Homeowners Association, after learning about Karen's violations, decided to hold her accountable for violating HOA rules. Not only had she been destroying protected trees, but she had also failed to pay her dues for months, all while harassing neighbors for the smallest infractions. Later that day, Karen received a formal notice from both the federal government and the HOA. Her reign of terror over the neighborhood had come to a screeching halt. The same woman who had tried to enforce rules on everyone else was now the one who had to answer for breaking them. As for Whiskers, she was perfectly fine. A little shaken, but no harm done. The tree stood tall, its branches swaying in the breeze, a symbol of justice served in the most unexpected way. The next few days were nothing short of chaotic for Karen. The HOA, having received all the evidence they needed, sent a team over to her house to conduct a full investigation. It was a matter of principle now, and they were going to make an example of her. Her neighbors, who had once been too intimidated to speak up, started to rally against her. What Karen didn't know was that she had made herself public enemy number one in the entire neighborhood. People were talking, and they were done staying silent. But for Sarah and me, things were quieter. Life slowly returned to normal, with Whiskers happily lounging under the elderberry tree again. Yet, I could feel the unease still hanging in the air. The real weight of what had happened had yet to hit Karen, and when it did, I had no idea just how much worse it would get. One evening, Sarah and I were sitting on the porch, the cool breeze brushing against our faces. We were talking about everything and nothing when suddenly, a car pulled up in front of Karen's house. I noticed that the windows were rolled down and the engine was running. Something about it didn't feel right. My instincts kicked in. It wasn't the usual cars from the HOA or the police. No, this was something else. I looked at Sarah. "Do you think she's going to try something crazy?" Sarah's brow furrowed. "She's unpredictable, but she's also desperate. Desperate people do stupid things." Just as she finished speaking, two figures stepped out of the car. Neither of them were familiar. They weren't from the HOA or any law enforcement I recognized. One of them was tall, dressed in a black leather jacket, and the other had a more casual appearance, but carried a sense of authority. They seemed to be heading straight to Karen's front door, and it didn't take long for the tension to escalate. The door swung open with a force that startled me from the porch. I could barely hear the conversation from where we were sitting, but I could see Karen standing in her driveway, hands gesturing wildly as she argued with the two visitors. Her voice was loud, sharp, but also tinged with panic. It was clear she wasn't expecting this. The taller man spoke first, his voice calm but firm. "You've made a lot of enemies, Karen. The HOA isn't the only thing you've got to worry about now. We've been watching you for a while." Karen's face flushed, and she stepped back from the men, looking almost defeated. "What are you talking about? I didn't do anything wrong." But the man wasn't listening to her protests. Instead, he stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "The problem is you didn't realize who you were messing with. You're in deeper than you think, and now it's time to pay the price." I could see Sarah tense up beside me. She stood slowly, her eyes never leaving the scene in front of us. It was clear she didn't trust what was going on. The two men seemed to be giving Karen some kind of ultimatum, but the details were still unclear. I watched them exchange a few more words before one of the men handed Karen a sealed envelope, the kind you get when something important or official needs to be served. Karen's hand shook as she accepted it, and the men turned, walking back to their car without another word. As they drove off, Karen stood frozen in the driveway, the envelope still clutched in her hands. She looked like she had seen a ghost. The next morning, Sarah and I went for our usual walk. The neighborhood was buzzing, and the gossip mill was working overtime. By the time we reached Karen's house, the mailbox was open, and she was standing in her front yard, looking like she had just received the worst news of her life. "Sarah, you have to hear this," a neighbor called out, her voice filled with excitement. She walked up to us, a look of disbelief on her face. "Karen just got served with papers. They're federal charges, Sarah. There's more to this whole tree situation than anyone realized." I raised an eyebrow. "Federal charges?" "Yeah, apparently she's been involved in some pretty shady dealings. More than just cutting down trees," the neighbor continued, lowering her voice as if afraid someone might hear. "She's been running an illegal operation under everyone's noses, and now it's all coming to light." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "What kind of operation?" The neighbor looked around nervously before answering. "Smuggling. Endangered species, rare plants, stuff that's worth a lot on the black market. I guess she thought the HOA would never find out, but now it's all connected." I felt the air in my lungs freeze as the words hit me. It was one thing to mess with our tree, but to be involved in smuggling endangered species was a whole new level of wrong. Karen wasn't just a neighbor with a vendetta against our garden. She was dangerous, and now it seemed like she had stirred up a whole web of trouble. As the days went on, Sarah stayed in contact with the authorities, who were now working on a larger investigation into Karen's activities. The neighborhood's chatter grew louder, but this wasn't just about a feud anymore. This was a criminal case that had taken root right under our noses, and Sarah was doing everything she could to help bring it all to light. But Karen wasn't going to go down without a fight. The situation had escalated so quickly that she started acting out in ways that made the entire neighborhood uneasy. It was clear she wasn't just afraid of the consequences. She was panicking. She had no idea who to trust anymore, and the more she tried to cover her tracks, the deeper she dug herself into a hole. Then, one night, Sarah received a mysterious phone call. I was sitting next to her when the phone rang. She answered it quietly, and after a few seconds, her face tightened. "I need to go," she said, hanging up the phone. "I'll be back soon." I didn't ask questions. I knew something big was happening, and it wasn't going to wait for anyone. I sat on the porch later that night, waiting for Sarah to return. I knew she was doing everything she could to help the authorities close in on Karen, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. Karen had gone too far, and I feared there was more to her story than anyone realized. Then, at around midnight, Sarah came back. Her face was drawn, her eyes tired but sharp. She walked straight to me without saying a word, her gaze intense. "Something's happened," she said, her voice low. "It's not just about trees anymore. Karen's in serious trouble, and now she's desperate enough to do anything." The stakes were getting higher. The neighborhood had become a powder keg, and Karen had set the match. We were no longer just dealing with a petty HOA dispute over a tree. This had turned into something much bigger, and I had no idea where it would go next. But one thing was for sure. Whatever happened, we were going to be in the thick of it. The days following Sarah's phone call were filled with tension. The whole neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next big move in this bizarre and escalating drama. The gossip was nonstop, with every resident whispering about Karen's past and the web of crimes she had woven. But we were all still in the dark about just how deep this ran. Sarah spent hours on the phone, coordinating with the authorities. It was clear she wasn't just helping with the situation. She was on the front lines of something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. She had been working with wildlife protection for years, but now, everything she knew was being put to the test. The stakes had never been higher. That evening, as we sat down for dinner, there was a knock at the door. Sarah stood up immediately, a look of concern crossing her face. She opened the door to find a man standing on the porch, his face grave. "Is everything okay?" I asked, but before Sarah could respond, the man stepped forward, handing her an envelope. "This just came through," he said, looking around cautiously before leaving without saying another word. Sarah ripped open the envelope and unfolded the document inside. Her expression darkened as she read through it. "Karen's been moving wildlife illegally, but there's more, much more," Sarah muttered, almost to herself. She looked up at me. "They found connections to organized crime. This goes beyond anything I expected." I could feel the weight of her words sink in. What started as a small spat over a tree had now turned into a federal investigation involving criminal syndicates. The wildlife smuggling operation Karen had been running wasn't just affecting the local area. It was a part of a much larger, more dangerous network. A few days later, Sarah was called in to help with a raid on one of Karen's known associates. The authorities had gotten wind of a warehouse outside the city where rare animals and plants were being stored for transport. It was the final piece of the puzzle. With Sarah's expertise, they planned to dismantle the operation. I stayed at home, the quiet of the house almost suffocating in its stillness. My thoughts kept drifting back to the tree, Whiskers, and how this whole mess had started. It was unbelievable that a simple act of shooting at a tree had snowballed into something that would take down an entire underground network. As the hours ticked by, I couldn't help but wonder how far Karen would go to protect herself. She had already tried to hide behind her HOA mask, but now she was exposed. There was no way she could get out of this unscathed. Not after everything that had come to light. Sarah returned late that night, her expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. She sat down beside me, her shoulders sagging. She didn't need to say anything for me to know that they had hit the warehouse. The operation had been a success, but Karen's involvement was just the beginning. They found everything denied, every piece of evidence. This wasn't just a tree she shot at. It was a symptom of a much larger issue, Sarah said, her voice heavy with the weight of the day's events. I nodded, not knowing what to say. The thought of Karen, our neighbor, the one who had seemed so harmless, being involved in such serious criminal activity made my skin crawl. How many lives had been affected by her greed and selfishness? How many animals and plants had suffered because of her? "I don't think Karen's going to be walking away from this," Sarah added softly, as if reassuring herself more than me. "There's no way she can wriggle out of this now. She's going down." But Karen's pride, her need for control, wouldn't let her go down without a fight. The following morning, I woke up to the sound of sirens, and for a moment, I thought the day had just started with more drama. But it wasn't just any sirens. They were different. They were closer. I rushed outside and saw a sea of law enforcement vehicles lining the street. Sarah had already left for the investigation, but this was clearly something bigger. As I watched, I saw Karen's house surrounded by officers, her property being searched. She had been caught trying to flee. The next few days were a blur. Karen was arrested, and all of her illegal activities came to light. The charges stacked up quickly: wildlife smuggling, illegal trafficking of endangered species, violating federal conservation laws. The authorities had uncovered an entire operation involving rare plants and animals from all over the world, and it all traced back to her. The community was in shock, but there was a strange sense of relief, too. The neighborhood could finally breathe again. The once powerful HOA enforcer was now nothing more than a criminal. And as for the elderberry tree that had started it all, it stood tall, untouched by the chaos, a symbol of resilience and justice. As I sat on the porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had transpired. It started with a small, seemingly insignificant act, Karen shooting at the tree. But from that one act of defiance, a chain of events had been set in motion that exposed a dangerous criminal network. Sarah sat beside me, her hand resting gently on mine. We didn't need to say anything. The silence between us said it all. This battle had been won, but there was still much work to be done. The world was a much stranger place than I had ever realized, and sometimes the biggest battles weren't fought with weapons or words. They were fought with justice and determination. As we sat there, the evening breeze carrying away the remnants of the day, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a victory for us. It was a victory for every living thing that had been harmed by Karen's actions. And I could only hope that the lesson she'd learned would be one that others would never forget. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more intense, real-life stories of justice served. See you in the next one.